we'll start and let people kind of drift in. Good evening. Welcome to an event that we've rather lengthily titled Did We Mean Participate or Did We Mean Something Else? My name is Shumon Basar. I'm directing the new Curatorial Practice and Cultural Projects Initiative here at the AA. And my co-host is Markus Miessen, who's Unit Master of Intermediate 7. We're privileged to kind of host this event, essentially what is our home turf, and so we feel very honoured to be able to share kind of a project that Markus and I have done together with a whole host of collaborators, and we feel very privileged to be able to share it here at the AA with our colleagues and our friends. The occasion for the event is this book that Markus and I co-edited, which came out about a month ago, which is called Did Someone Say Participate? An Atlas of Spatial Practice. And Markus will talk a little bit about actually the relationship between this event that we're holding this evening and the book. What I'd like to do is just move very swiftly onto introducing our guests this evening. There are three of our London contributors. Directly ahead of me we have Celine Condorelli. Celine is an architect who's based in London. She's senior lecturer at London Metropolitan University and previously the University of East London. And she works at the interface between art and architecture collaborations. Recent projects have included the support structure with the artist curator Gavin Wade, and also the taxonomy project with Beatrice Gibson here. Beatrice is a new media artist based in London, currently collaborating obviously with Celine here. Beatrice has implemented numerous new media projects that utilize digital technology as a medium for the reappropriation of the city, constructing both online interfaces and tool-based systems. On my left we have Joseph Grima. Joseph is an AA educated architect, a product of the system here, and a member of the cross-disciplinary team Multiplicity that includes artists, urbanists, architects, filmmakers and writers. For the last couple of years Joseph's been part of the editorial team under Stefano Boeri's editorship at Domus magazine, and recent research has included the kind of perhaps those of you at the door, if you want to come in, please. If you want to, there are chairs next door. If you want to grab them and then come through. Yeah, this is good. You'll understand in a minute why our beautiful layout is being kind of subverted in a very positive way. A number of us are, actually all of us are also undertaking a PhD at the newly established Goldsmith Centre of Research Architecture. So that's who we are. Markus, perhaps you'd like to say something about this evening.
Yeah. You might have all realized that we're sitting in a slightly different setup tonight. The reason why the seats are organized like this is because if you look at the screen, you might see the UNESCO building in Paris, which we find is quite an interesting building. The reason for that being that when it was set up in 1952, it was a trilateral collaboration in which the architects at the time weren't mentioned. And the three architects were Marcel Breuer, Bernard Serfus and Pierluigi Nervi. So it was a collaboration between an American architect, an Italian architect and a French architect. But through the collaboration they weren't named. So they just basically appeared as a kind of collaborative practice for that particular project. I also quickly want to read out something about the UNESCO. It actually stands for United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. It's a specialized agency of the United Nations established in 1945 that promotes international collaboration through education, science and culture. Today, UNESCO functions as a laboratory of ideas and a standard setter to forge universal agreements on emerging ethical issues. The organization also serves as a clearinghouse for the dissemination and sharing of information and knowledge, while helping member states to build their human and institutional capacities in diverse fields. So basically what we've done, which might to some of you seem a bit pretentious, but basically we've laid out the floor plan of the lecture hall according to the three wings of the UNESCO building in Paris. I'm also quickly going to introduce, unfortunately we've only got it on one screen,
That's
something... okay. So, basically what we're going to do is we're going to give you a quick introduction about the book and what we try to do with the book. And then we'll have 4 presentations. Unfortunately, Matthew Murphy couldn't make it tonight because he's very ill. So we kind of rearranged, and Celine will do kind of 1.5 presentations. Just to quickly also say something about the reason of this event in relation to the book, is that we saw the book as a kind of starting point for a series of events, of which this is one of them, and we'll later also talk a little bit about the other events that we've set up already. Yeah?
Yeah. Okay, we're just going to flip through some sort of bullet points that denote the kind of conceptual territory that the book is both a product of and hopes to kind of map out. So, first slide.
Yeah, we only have this on one screen, unfortunately, so you all have to turn around. That's the pleasure of the layout.
Absolutely. Okay, so since the end of history in the wake of 9/11, the relationships between space, politics and power have come to the fore in almost all zones of cultural activity. Today, the need to identify and instrumentalize, quote, spatial practices becomes relevant due to the unprecedented visibility of what one might call, quote, globalization at work. From Iraq to Nepal, Dubai to Mumbai, a new atlas is being redrawn for the 21st century. Next slide. According to the journalist Tom Friedman in his book The World is Flat, the beginning of this century will be remembered for inverting the discovery made by Columbus several centuries ago. Globalization, Friedman argues, links every place and non-place, potentially with every place and non-place, in symmetrical or asymmetrical ways. So, our book hopes that to portray the notion that instead of continuing a kind of myth that posits that the architect is the one who is actually in charge, we're putting forward the idea that there's a kind of new generation or a new species of spatial practitioners who are both analyzing and contributing to the relationship between space and politics. And so what was once seen as the defensive preserve of architects, i.e. mapping, making or manipulating spaces, has become a new culture of space, produced and shaped by an ever-increasing number of disciplines. What we hope to do is showcase a range of forward-thinking practitioners and theorists who actively trespass or participate in neighboring or alien knowledge spaces. At the top, we have the, I think one of the sort of paradigm images of the modern heroic architect and his kind of genius hand at play, which is Louis Kahn. At the bottom, and arguably someone who is also whose hand works in a similar kind of series of gestures to Louis Kahn at the top, but whose the ramifications of which are perhaps much more larger in scale and more grave in impact, which is Tommy Lee Franks, the commander of the coalition forces in Iraq in 2003.
There's also something interesting very recently about 3 words. The C word, which is consensus, the P word, which is participation, and the S word, which is sustainability. And they're all very ill-defined in terms of how people perceive them as terms. And of course, there is somehow an issue with participation as a word, and it's often misunderstood, and we've often been asked what we really mean by participation in the context of the book. We'll speak about that in a second, but one thing that we're really interested in is looking at consensus and how consensus often in architecture or kind of urban planning is being perceived. If you look at this image, you'll probably remember the Yo Blair greeting that Bush was giving to Tony Blair in St. Petersburg at the G8 summit this year. There's something really interesting for us in terms of how modes of participation are often based on consensus, and whether this kind of participation is something whether we're interested in, we don't really think so. So what we really think is that as a kind of romantic model of participation that's out there, which is often understood as a kind of means of social engagement, we're trying to break away from that kind of understanding of participation and rather look at participation as a model for conflict, not in the sense of kind of violent conflict, but in terms of conflict as discussion. And really think about the participant as a kind of uninvited outsider who's trying to participate in alien fields of knowledge. So the subtitle of the book is An Atlas of Spatial Practice, and the last time I went to my grandmother's house, I found this atlas, and it had this really beautiful image on the first page, which is the first ever scientific mapping based on an understanding of the world being a globe rather than a flat plate. And interestingly, it's actually from 285 BC. And what's quite amazing is that, of course, it was a kind of first attempt to map out a world that yet one wouldn't really understand physically. But if you look at it, it's actually quite amazing how precise it already is. But basically what we're trying to say with this image is that hundreds of years ago somebody sat down to kind of try to draw a first attempt of a map, but it actually needed this first attempt to start tracing kind of layer upon layer to finally come up with a kind of coherent image of the physical space that we live in. In terms of the other events that we see this event as kind of part in, we've done 3 events so far. One was part of the 24-hour interview marathon at the Serpentine Gallery this year. And we just did 2 events in New York, one at Columbia and one at Van Allen. And basically the idea was that each individual evening or each individual event is set up in a completely different way, and that the book is a starting point for discussion, and that each event tries to happen in that kind of rhythm, right? Sure.
So, as Markus mentioned, there's a kind of allusion to the notion of an atlas, and on the left you'll see a book called a Junior General Knowledge Encyclopedia, which is a book that I was in our house when I was growing up, and somehow in its rather slim 180 odd pages managed to define the entirety of the known universe. And somehow we like that kind of, again, that kind of weird contradiction of sort of, on the one hand, attempting to map out something that's unmappable, i.e. the totality of something, and also accepting the limits at some point, that the thing has to have limits, and it has to have a size and a weight and a kind of maximum page number. And we're aware of the kind of the tension between the two, but I think, as Markus said, you have to sort of start somewhere. Next slide, please, Markus. And there are kind of a number of things happening in the in the kind of space of the book and how you maneuver through the pages. And our graphic designers, who are a wonderful group in London called Orbaka, sort of embedded a number of very interesting and sort of witty projects into the various settings and sites of the pages and the cover. And this is one project they did, which is actually in what's called the end papers of the book. And the end papers of the book are these few pages that you always get at the beginning and the end of a book, which are normally entirely blank. And what they've done is they've taken all 200 plus flags from every single nation state in the world, and they've broken all the constitutive elements down and created this what they call a war alphabet, which is every single icon an emblem that's embedded in all the flags, and this is now an operative type, so you can actually type in flag language. And next slide, please. And the last thing that they've done is I think they were very interested as graphic designers, who are normally limited to making marks on pages, but their question was, do we really ever effectuate genuine kind of change in the way that architects or politicians do? So what they've done here is completely redesigned the world map, and there are a number of things happening here. So Iran is next to USA and North Korea, so they form a new kind of friendly continent. And there's actually a phrase that's spelt out here. Can you see what it says? Markus, can you drag the cursor over the words?
There we go.
Okay. The future is inside. Yes. And this relates to a contribution by the curator Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who wrote the preface to our book, where Hans-Ulrich collated a really fascinating list of definitions of the future by various artists and photographers and thinkers and philosophers, and we decided to add the most latest kind of addition to this list, which is the future is inside. So again, we tried to make a subtle relationship between the inside and the outside of the book, and that's part of the kind of navigation. So we're going to now, that's the introduction. So it gives me great pleasure now to move on to our first contributor. The way it's going to work is that we've asked each of our guests to prepare a kind of 10-minute presentation loosely on the notion of spatial practice and spatial practitioners. And so they're going to go through these, which will appear on these two screens behind me. On the screen over there, Markus is still trying to figure out modern technology, and he will be our secretary for the evening. And as secretary, Markus will be compiling what we call a lexicon of spatial practice. So these will be kind of key terms. Having problems there? No, it's okay. These will be kind of key terms that crop up during the evening, which we will condense and hopefully put together as a downloadable poster and document on our website. And also we'll form the basis, the kind of spine of the discussion after the three presentations. So, Joseph, it's over to you.
Thank you. So I really like the term that you used in the presentation of this event, which is ruminations. And I think it's very descriptive of the whole book, but in particular my research in this book is kind of a loose collection of facts, which is centered around the topic of outsourcing. And my interest in this was to do with the fact that spatial practitioners are not just architects. There's you can consider just about anybody spatial practitioner, from a multinational corporation to an artists, architects, telecommunications companies. My interest was in kind of looking at, on this particular subject, kind of like as wide as possible variety of the interpretations of the phenomenon and its effects on the landscape, on space, and its relationship with space, because, of course, it's a non-physical phenomenon. My particular interest was in the way that it brings together extremely diverse realities, realities which are usually extremely distant one from the other, and also extremely unequal. And so I started by mapping out some of the, very loosely, some of the relationships between countries that purchase services through outsourcing and those that provide it. And of course, one of the interesting things that came out is a whole range of forces that bring the behind this, from kind of like the legacy of the colonial legacy of countries such as Britain, which tie it into India and places where the language has been inherited, but also economic relations, and also kind of post-pseudo-colonial relationships such as the USA with Philippines and so on. Anyway, so that was kind of the point of departure. And what I did was I investigated a whole bunch of these stories kind of in different locations around the world, and to kind of give it a more human interface somehow, kind of look at the people's first-person quotes. Time doesn't allow me to read them out, but the pictures aren't particularly good, but there's this kind of incredible homogeneity of the spaces, and this incredible diversity of their locations. And for example, India and all of those countries that we saw before with England, but also France, having had very strong colonial relationships with Africa, is setting up increasingly outsourcing from Dakar and so on. And this is and Italy, which doesn't really have a colonial history, was forced to look to Romania, which is the only country which has Latin, a kind of a Latin language which was sufficiently poor to be able to be employed in this way. So this is a kind of group photo. And this is another fascinating case of this, is the region of Manchuria, Dalian in China, which was subjected to colonial control by Japan, and is now the largest location of outsourcing for the Japanese market in China. So, and these are some of the workers, because they speak equally well Japanese and Chinese in this region. And so this, for your keywords, is quite fascinating. It's the company is called Recom, which it stands for Real Communication. So it's kind of got this, already got quite corporate. And then there's this sort of alphabet of lexicon. R for real, I think real power rule. It's very kind of Chinglish. E for enterprising, C for challenge, O for open, M for management, M for mind. It's kind of like all of these bizarre keywords that come together and then translate into Chinese. And then one of the other fascinating things that kind of came out of this was that, apart from the colonial legacy and linguistic relations, another invisible force at play on this international market is the global map of fiber optic cables, which is shown in this image. And you get some really fascinating, obviously this is kind of like a map of partly of the kind of like where the relations between industrialized nations. But one of the fascinating case studies was the island of Mauritania, off the coast on the south of Africa, which is, the pointer doesn't work, but you can see that there's a fiber optic cable that goes past, linking it to Asia. And it's become one of the major one of the major economies of the country has become outsourcing, because of the fact that telecommunications are so cheap. And from there, there's the outsourcing over the years, and this is the most probably what we're most familiar with, is the telecommunications outsourcing. But then from there, it spread out into even architecture. There's a company in India called Satelier, which provides architectural outsourcing. So you can have a two-person team in London, and you can buy time, cluster time, on the. They have these clusters which will work for you on particular projects. It's kind of fascinating how this actually operates, because you send your sketches across to India, and they, in the evening when your team goes to bed, and then when you wake up in the morning, you've got all the CAD files waiting for you. And this is the operating center in the middle there with all the clocks for the different time zones around the world. Another fascinating, rather amusing case study is Kerala in India, and also the various parts of Africa which are of Catholic, under Catholic influence due to their history. And there's even been a case where, in various cases where in Europe there aren't enough priests who actually say votive masses for all of the faithful. So they've actually been emailing the requests for prayers to India and Africa, along with donations, and the priests have been doing specially celebrated masses for the Europeans. Another fascinating one is Bronco Communications in California, who had the brilliant idea of a couple of years ago they set up a call center which actually operates with drive-through McDonald's and Burger King, various fast food chains. Basically, what happens is you speak into when you drive into the drive-through, you speak into the little box, and you're not actually speaking to the person inside the booth as you imagine you are, but you're actually speaking to a call center 500 miles away. And they're typing in your order on the internet, and that's being sent back to the kitchen, who are preparing. Like, it's incredibly convoluted, but apparently they can cut off 7 seconds per order, which over a whole day adds up to 20 minutes of saved time. Another really fascinating one is a company called C-Code, which has invented the concept of hybrid sourcing, and they've purchased there's a lot of bad will against outsourcing, especially in the States, because it's seen as basically giving jobs away to foreign countries. And so what they've done is they've purchased this cruise ship, and they're refitting it at present. It's going to be launched probably sometime in spring for 300 software engineers to work on it, and they can actually dock in Los Angeles or somewhere on the coast of California. And as long as they're every 60 days they go with more than 30 miles out from the coast, they actually can legally employ Chinese and Indian software engineers, and the clients can actually come and visit the boat as though they were going to a normal office, but they've got the lower overheads and costs of these Indian workers. Of course, also live on the boat, so they don't have any. They're very happy to be there, of course. And the fascinating thing is how they actually bring these software engineers into the country, because of course they can't pass immigration, so they use the legislation from to do with merchant seamen, who are actually they're taken to the border of Mexico, and then they're accompanied through the border by the police and onto the ship, and that's it's really incredibly ingenious. And then another fascinating story is the gold farmers, who have become gained quite a bit of visibility recently. But it's basically young Chinese. Can we have sound, please? Mainly Chinese kids who spend all of their time in. The sound doesn't seem to be working properly. Is it on the computers? It's not.
Yeah, it's plugged in.
That's good. I'll play it like this. Chinese kids who spend all of the time in World of Warcraft killing monsters so as to gain points, and they actually, once their character has become powerful enough inside the game, they sell it to lazy European and American players who can't be bothered to reach level 60. And so you kind of get basically a shortcut into the top levels of the game, and you can pay maybe $200, $300 for your identity, depending on depending how wealthy and how lazy you are. And this is actually the reality. This is on YouTube. A Chinese guy made a documentary about this, about these gold farms. And it's all these kids who actually live in these incredibly, they're like warehouses of computers. They just spend 24 hours, they're given food and very basic lodging. They just spend all of their time in these virtual worlds. And they get obviously paid a lot more than they would in any other profession in that part of the world. And anyway, we'll move on to the next. And this is another fascinating and slightly tragic and slightly bizarre situation. And I'm going to put this straight onto a film, which I think is the best way to.
Well, lots of people fire fake guns during video games, but now there's a way to use a computer to fire an actual gun and potentially kill live animals. So-called internet hunting has prompted a firestorm of controversy and a possible ban right here in Wisconsin. Linda Eggert has more now from our news center. Linda.
Well, if you've never heard about this, it's kind of hard to believe, but this is a Texas website, liveshot.com. It aims to collect money from hunters who hope to kill something big with just a tiny mouse.
Think you need a weapon to go hunting? Think again.
Computer shooting system.
Inside a shed in Texas is a robotic .22 caliber rifle system people all over the world are tapping into. Literally. The website liveshot.com lets computer users log on and start firing a remote rifle just by clicking a mouse. Right now there are only targets to shoot at. But starting next month, you can hunt live animals. For $300, you'll get control of a remote camera and rifle and be able to fire real-time bullets at non-native Texas animals like Barbary and sheep, antelope, and wild hogs. Many Wisconsin hunters are outraged.
Well, when I first heard it, I just thought it was crazy. I mean, I just said, what are we doing around?
Yeah, kind of between the bizarre and the tragic. And of course, the most tragic of all probably is the issue of the outsourcing of torture, in which governments actually go against their own laws and subvert their the protection that they're supposed to offer to actually through agreements with other countries, where they basically ferry people out into places such as Egypt and Libya and Jordan, where they are depending on the nature of the information they need to get out of them, they are subjected to various forms of confinement, torture, or so one of the people I'm working with is a guy called Trevor Paglin, who's been through a very particular way of he's basically got access to a number of to a list of all of the registration numbers of CIA's anonymous planes, and through that he's been constructing a global map of the outsourcing of torture. And it's that's something we're working on at the moment. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. Celine, please. F-I-B-R-E. It's 2 words. Fibronoptis.
Okay, so I mean, I'm going to talk about. I'm going to be a little bit schizophrenic and have 2 personalities. So first, I'm going to talk about one particular project called Support Structure, which is a collaboration with an artist curator, Gavin Wade. I'd like to talk about this just or mostly. In relationship to this notion of a practitioner, of a spatial practitioner. And I will then take my other persona and be part of Taxonomy, which is another collaboration with an artist, B, who's here, who you've had the introduction for. So support structure is maybe quite directly related to a sort of architectural practice, or the notion, an expanded notion of what an architectural practice might be. This is a long-term project that has been developed with Gavin with a sort of slightly grandiose remit, which was to design a universally adaptive support structure. The collaboration, I think, first of all, is interesting in the sense of not actually outsourcing, but working with people who might allow you to develop a practice beyond the sort of traditional boundaries of your own practice. So just a few words about this is that, which I think are quite interesting in terms of also students usually working on their own, or as architects having always these grandiose ideas about what you can develop by yourself. Gavin and I are not friends. The idea of a collaboration in this case is really about being able to reach different territories, gain different angles on very similar interests that allow you to expand on what you might be able to do yourself, which means that the work we often do together, or rather all of the times when we've worked together, but the both of us end up with things that we can't quite recognize, meaning they're not born out of my aesthetics or his, but we're actually able to supersede our own limitations through this notion of a collaboration. So the universally adaptive support structure is a sort of series of objects and exhibitions that we've developed through a learning process. The learning process was really in terms of thinking about this as an architectural prototype. So the exhibitions were, or the projects were applied to different types of sites. We went through an art site, the Chisenhale Gallery, then a corporate site, which was the Economist. We were artists in residence for at the Economist building, where the Economist magazine is, for a few weeks, and then with a resulting exhibition, then a community site, which was the Portsmouth Cultural Centre, a multicultural centre, a political site, which was Greenham Common, which some of you might know, some of you not, maybe. But I don't really want to go into detail of the phases. And then the last one was an educational site, which was a university. So there's something that I like to mention in relationship to, again, what the notion of an alternative architectural practice might be. In Italian, architect is a verb. So somebody architects is something that you do rather than something that you do two things. And I would like to think about this process of architecting as one might engineer to architect situations and things that have to do with space, but mostly have to do with how one actually inhabits or interacts with space. So the notion of learning and activation are actually quite fundamental to this idea of a spatial practitioner. So support structures are things that most literally can be exemplified by things like scaffolding, which are applied to buildings before the building exists and after. In the case, for example, of an earthquake or actually, I mean, there's a specific example that I always talk about, which is on Mount Etna in Sicily after quite a massive earthquake in 2003. Some of the Baroque cities on Mount Etna were literally held together by scaffolding. And this is the point when something like a support structure is also a point of delaying a moment of crisis. So it is a constant reminder of what has happened, and it still allows possibilities, which means that a lot of things might happen. These buildings might remain, these buildings might be destroyed, and the scaffolding is a sort of interface which is somehow slightly invisible. We know that it's not quite as important as the building is supposed to support, but an interface that is a moment of potentiality, so a moment for potential things to develop. Oops. So the aesthetic of what the temporary might be as opposed to the permanent is also, within an architectural methodology, a way to think about change. So that the structures that one can think of are also within a process of making proposals and developing towards other things to happen. Within the support structure remit, it means that our territory is until these other things are allowed to happen, and this is the point when we decide to disappear. I think this is the last one. So again, I mean, this is a presentation that is completely exclusively made from the website, so the sixth phase, which we're currently working on, is trying to think of what possible methodologies might have grown out of this collaboration, to think about how this action can be translated within a territory of architecture as well as a territory of art for possibilities for action. That's it. Very brief.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Sure. So this is when I become someone else. Okay. I mean, this is the taxonomy is another collaboration. This is also inhabiting a territory between art and architecture. B and I have been working together for about a year and a half. Maybe something just about this kind of art territory, which in our case has been really just the environment that has given us the space to really think about research as a way to do practice, rather than separating it from possible implementation. So we're really interested in this notion of research by design. Again, B and I had very related practices, very similar interests that we were looking at from different angles. So between art and architecture, we decided to establish work through self-initiated projects, meaning the research that is in the book, which is mostly something that we did in Mumbai at Christmas 2004, was actually the very initial remit of us trying to find what kind of territory, what kind of site we were trying to define. So the project is actually a platform for action. And within this idea of research by design, the Mumbai City Dictionary is something that became a product by itself and was part of exhibitions as well as part of in the book, but it was really about us trying to prepare and recognize what a site might be for a project entitled Taxonomy.
Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit about the project and Celine will go through the website, so do that. So Taxonomy is a project that Taxonomy is a project that inhabits and colonizes, transforms the taxi, using it as a tool through which to rethink and propose a series of interventions and/or alternative interfaces within and through the territory of the urban. So included in these projects are a proposal for a mobile archive, which proposes the transformation and adaptation of the taxi into a locative dictionary and annotation tool that works at the scale of the city, which allows the public to edit, author and tag space as they move through it, and Taxonomy Mumbai, which is its related research project, which we're going to talk about today and which is in the book. So Taxonomy Mumbai constituted the exploration and excavation of, to paraphrase from the book, a kind of alien knowledge space. So a kind of unofficial spatial territory in Mumbai. That is the amazing and often ingenious alternative navigational systems and practices of its inhabitants that exists in the absence of available and complete cartographies, in the absence, in other words, of maps. Celine and I were looking at these kinds of practices with a view to how they might be, one, documented, so articulated or rendered visible as a set of unofficial spatial practices that sit alongside or lurk beneath our more conventional perception of navigational methodologies, and two, how they might be appropriated, so how they might be leveraged by us and transformed into something propositional. So essentially we were interested in both uncovering and mapping these practices and subsequently in using the results of these mappings as a kind of tool to propose and develop alternative systems for ordering space. So if you want to talk a bit about the categories.
I'll just say something about how this research was established. So the first thing is that in Mumbai or Bombay, taxis never know where you want to go. They just don't. There's no such thing as addresses that work with simple street names and numbers. So postal addresses work with sort of incremental points of recognition. So there are some places that everybody knows in the city, and then close to those places there are other places that the people in the neighborhood will know, etc., until you actually get to your destination. Which means that it is a completely malleable and much more organic navigational system which does not rely on the idea of a plan. God's eye view is something that just does not exist. I mean, of course, for different reasons. The city does not publish city maps because they have some kind of security paranoia, which means that also things like GPS signals are scrambled. So inevitably, if you have a GPS within the city of Mumbai, it always tells you that you're in the middle of the sea. But also because, I mean, of course, people would mostly not be able to read maps. So this is just anyway completely useless. So the way that one finds his own way is by asking other people. So it's a sort of hugely collaborative process, which means that of course it takes forever. But the workshops that we established, we realized very quickly that the only way to understand navigation in a place like Mumbai was to have second-hand knowledge or third-hand knowledge. So we established base camps in different public spaces of the city and asked other people to go and ask for directions. What they came back with were lists of navigational items, like turn left at the cafe, which we then classified together. So this classification is the result of 7 days, an entire week, working in public space with people who were inhabitants of Mumbai. So we actually sat and classified, wrote down what people actually gave us.
There's an inordinate amount of data. Okay, do you want to go through the categories? Or?
Well, they're here. I mean, landmarks, routes, boundaries, stories and fictions, networks and time. What is quite interesting about these, of course, is that some of them are visible and some of them are invisible. And it seemed that one of the most important aspects, maybe, of these items was really scale. Again, from the global to the personal. So what the entire city knows to what only yourself might know. And how all of these together create the sort of mental maps that one uses to navigate through a city.
So there are over 120 items in the Mumbai dictionary, but the nature of the dictionary, much like the encyclopedia that you mentioned, is that it's never complete. And the Mumbai City Dictionary is really testament to that. It could never really be finished and doesn't really aspire to completeness. So as a project then, the situations that it generates are as much a part of the work as the book itself. Really sadly, we don't have pictures of the workshops of the base camps. But what both the resulting situations and the book show and reveal is that there's an inherent relationship between language and place. Fluidity of this relationship is what defines the city as lived and is based on a constant process of exchange between the inhabitant and his or her city. So we thought it might be interesting to show you a specific part of the database that really sort of illustrates this point, which is in the stories and fictions category. Just wait for the thing to bring them up.
Oops, sorry. Invisible.
So this is an extract from that category that relates to one road and its naming. The road was called Muhammad Ali Road, and it's quite an interesting road because it runs through a large working-class Muslim ghetto with a huge flyover of the same name that sort of looms above that, and it actually quite literally splices this sort of marginalised community in two. The flyover's edges are lined by high-rise buildings no more than 3 feet away from it, so when you drive along it, you really have the feeling that you're driving through people's living rooms. So on the day that we set up base camp there, students came back, 5 different students came back with 5 different stories as to the naming of the road and why it was named as it was named.
So the one was about the fact that Muhammad Ali was a famous political and religious leader. He was a major Muslim figurehead. I don't know if you can read, actually. It's probably a bit light. The strongest and most respected leader in the community, taking advantage of his position in the public imaginary, he named the road after himself. Second story, which again, was found. So these stories were simultaneous within this, quite big, but still relatively confined space. Was about Muhammad Ali Jinnah as an influential political leader in Pakistan. And after the partition, he became the first Prime Minister of Pakistan. He visited India, and during his trip to Bombay, won so much public respect that the road was named after him. Third story about the street was about 2 freedom fighters called Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, who were brothers. They took an oath to leave India only to return if independence had been gained from the British. Unfortunately, Muhammad Ali died whilst being in Europe. Fourth story is about a child being run over by a bus, I think, while traveling to school. the bus driver was a Hindu and the accident consequently viewed as deliberate. So a riot broke out and the Muslim faction suppressed the Hindus and named the road after the child, who happened to be called Muhammad Ali. You've probably guessed which one is the fifth story, which is the story I believed, of course. That's the one relating to the world famous boxer. I mean, what was interesting, one thing, of course, that was interesting about these stories is that they're all inherently Muslim symbols in very different ways. But so they did not undermine the identity of the street, but just sort of reassessed it in a different way.
So when Markus and Shumon emailed us and asked us to do the talk, they suggested talking about taxonomy in Mumbai as operational observation. And
Whatever that means.
Yeah, well, I actually quite like the term. I think there are two fundamental ways in which taxonomy can be considered as operational observation. One which we touched on already, which is the idea of the sort of spatial practitioner who actively trespasses sites and spaces, not only with a view to recording them, but in order to appropriate them, in this case as a kind of design methodology. And secondly, the idea of the research event itself as also somehow activating the site in which it's located. The placement of our base camps and the way the workshops were designed were crucial in this respect. Effectively, we turned everyday normal neighbourhoods into laboratories. Within a few hours of setting up, everyone was aware of our presence. All the participants were running around, and it was really like activating an area. There was a real sense of event. In addition, it wasn't, as Celine already said, it wasn't really us having a conversation with the city, it was the participants, and we were completely dependent on that. They had to engage with the city in a much more visceral way, and that prompted a kind of agency on their part. So yeah, I think I like the term operational observation, and in the context of spatial practice, I think it implies, of our particular kind of spatial practice, I think it implies a kind of methodology that is about sort of action and performativity in some way. It's about appropriation and reconfiguration over and above kind of a detached documentation. Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much. Okay. This is the point in the evening. It's been an hour. We don't want to take this much longer, but perhaps maybe for 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes max. We would like to perhaps, we'll soon open it up to the floor. They don't feel pressured to ask a searing and profound question. We will take comments. Actually, we'd really, in fact, almost prefer comments. But if you have questions, that would be great. So perhaps while you're mulling those over, and they can be about absolutely anything, preferably something that's been discussed so far this evening, but feel free. I just wanted to maybe kind of kick off and sort of talk about a couple of things that we mentioned in our kind of introduction. I think Joseph, when you were going through your piece on outsourcing, this is a real curveball question, but I know when you were writing the piece on outsourcing, at the same time you and Rem Koolhaas and Hans-Ulrich Obrist have been undertaking this project to sort of go and desperately interview all of the Japanese metabolists before they all die, which is a kind of hallmark of the Hans-Ulrich Obrist project of let's interview them before they cark it. You know, I think he waits to see when they get around their 80s, and then he'll go and do a special on them. And you've done something similar with the metabolists, which I know is there'll be a show and so on and so forth. I just wonder whether kind of doing these two research things in parallel, whether there were any kind of, in your own mind, any connections between the kind of world that the metabolists had been talking or kind of promising, and this notion of sort of outsourcing.
I'll move to here. It's easier. Well, yeah, I mean, one can think of many. Obviously, the two things aren't connected consciously in any way, because as always with Hans Ulrich, these things kind of just suddenly appear on the horizon, and the next day you're on a plane to Japan, and it's all kind of happening before you can even. And so at the time, I think I'd kind of started looking at outsourcing and so on. But I think Yeah, I mean, at the moment, the outsourcing thing is really just kind of like an archive of situations, and some of which are almost hypothetical. I mean, like the C code thing hasn't really actually started yet, but I think it's really fascinating. The thing that really fascinates me about all of these case studies is the ingenuity and the way that they're kind of amazingly full of potential, and the way that the kind of extreme pragmatism of business and of corporate logic is interfaces space in ways that an architect or a spatial practitioner in a conventional sense of the word would never, probably never come up with. And I guess the main connection with the metabolists would be the way that they were kind of incredibly interested in technology and the possibilities for all sorts of technologies contaminating the way that the city works. And so I guess when this kind of archive reaches a certain critical mass, I'd start to I'd like to start speculating on how this could inform a new type of city, or how the cities of the future are going to be shaped to some extent or affected by these phenomena, which are only increasing. They're almost, I mean, in an incredibly short period, like the call centers have been around for probably not more than 6 or 7 years, but they're almost commonplace. You don't even really, you have the shock the first time that you call them, and they kind of get Indian accents, and then next year it's it's become normal. You've become used to it, and I think that'll happen for all of these other bizarre and eccentric cases, and somehow they're going to work themselves into our everyday lives. But it would be interesting to speculate how one could actually channel them into design.
Maybe, can I quickly ask a question? In terms of the critical mass that you're talking about, I think that's quite interesting, because we just had this conversation last week about, at the round table basically, when is the moment that research becomes practice? So maybe you can say something in relation to that.
I think it kind of happens. I don't. Kind of happens. That's it. Don't worry. I'll take this other one. Yeah, that's better. Yeah. Feedback. Is this working? Yeah, it's working. Critical mass. I guess. I don't really know. I think it's just something that happens, and when you're doing a research project, you always get to. I guess you guys with the book, you probably got to a certain point where you'd written to a lot of different people who you knew were working on a variety of projects, and then you probably reached the point where you realised that the critical mass had been achieved, and it just kind of. I think these things are almost it's almost like an intuitive process, and I think. A lot of research, like design, a lot of it's about intuition, they're different stages of the same thing. You kind of get to a point of having enough ideas that getting more ideas wouldn't really be useful, and then converting them into designs it becomes more useful.
Well, the notion of critical mass is interesting, because when you were presenting, I was sort of trying to imagine. Could you rewind now from the way in which we live and our sort of dependence on outsourcing? If one day there was a kind of moratorium and it wouldn't be possible, like the notion of rewinding, and it seems to me, it's like many kind of traits of kind of globalization. It takes something that at first seems incredibly strange and other, or instantly familiarizes it and actually makes you completely kind of dependent on it in a way that's no longer exceptional. It's kind of the norm. So it's completely the norm to call up BT and be profoundly annoyed at Ravindra or whoever on the other end who can't understand a word you're saying. I'm allowed to be racist because I'm from Bangladesh. And you think, well, this is probably not going to change, is it? So.
Well, it's. I think the interesting thing about spatial practice is that it operates through stratification, and it's like each thing is building on another. All of these cities, in turn, like these phenomena related to telecommunications, such as outsourcing, and therefore by proxy all the cities that are being built in places like what's the name of the island off Africa? Anyway, around all sorts of parts of the world that are kind of close to a fiber optic cable, and where cities are being born because of this, and in turn that will probably lead on to something else, and it's like accumulation, really.
Actually, one of the things that was mentioned in our one of the discussions we had in New York was it was Reinhold Martin, actually, who sort of talked about how he says, let me talk about this from the point of view of a kind of materialist, and then he was talking about kind of fiber optics and basically glass, and the glass that is essentially, the kind of the material which somehow makes all of this possible, and that kind of way in which you go from the incredibly concrete, the sort of indubitably concrete aspect of kind of glass and the kind of material properties of glass to this, the thing that you're kind of talking about. And perhaps one other question before we move on to maybe something else, which was I was just wondering in your research on outsourcing whether you had a kind of notion that somehow the sort of history of architecture was already quite precocious in relation to outsourcing. I mean, I'm already thinking about various seminal architectural competitions. There's always a sense in which the League, the Palace of the Soviets was, the notion of the international competition, which is something that we've grown up with, we're sort of aware of. There's already a very early example, it seems to me, pre kind of digital technology, of a series of sutures between places that don't normally exist together.
I guess that's kind of true, but I don't think it's quite the same thing, because the international competition is a way based on the belief that the wider the field that you open it up to, the higher quality you're going to achieve, because you're starting from a larger base. Whereas I think the interesting thing about outsourcing is the way that it brings together profoundly diverse realities, and it's kind of like demand and supply are kind of disconnected from space in a way, or reconnected to space, but in either removing the aspect of time or contemporaneity. And I think it's in a way the interesting thing about outsourcing is that it's the natural evolution of the industrial one of the things that's built into the concept of the Industrial Revolution, which is that production is always located in the place where it'll be cheapest. And so therefore, I mean, you think even in our lifetimes, like when we were really small, maybe we had a few toys that were made in England, and then after that it was made in Hong Kong probably, then after a bit it was made in Taiwan, and then made in China. It's kind of, or made in Korea, kind of like this migration from place to place according to which is almost a direct mapping of the degree to which the societies where these things had evolved and therefore protected their workers. And so production always goes to the place that's least where workers are least protected, in a way. And it's the same for this, and now that this has become the case for services as well, which is really fascinating. Services have become almost an object of industrial production, the way that objects have been for probably 100 or 200 years.
I think another, just to perhaps finish on this before we open up, is I think one of the things that's happened in this process is a kind of the need then to identify by default which services cannot be outsourced. So I read somewhere like the haircut is like belongs to one of the sort of remaining species of things that it's pretty difficult to outsource somehow. And so I find that very interesting. But at the same time, there's a sort of strengthening of a robustness of the things that are resilient to the kind of the diffuseness and in a sense stay there.
Yeah.
Actually, I also quickly want to add something. I mean, in the sense of what you just described, I mean, how do you feel about a model like American Apparel? Do you think that's something that has a kind of future, or
American what?
American Apparel, the clothes shop?
Apparel, yeah.
I mean, do you think it's almost? I mean, if you kind of place it in that discourse of production, do you think it's almost like kind of ironic? I mean, could you look at it as almost kind of ironic, or do you think it's really model for potential?
I don't know. I guess American Apparel is you always get the exception, and there they've somehow managed to identify themselves with the exception, so therefore protecting American workers and so on. I think if everybody went back to using American workers, and then one company was producing stuff in China, it would. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, yeah, there's always exceptions to every rule, and sometimes the exceptions then become the rule, and then vice versa. So it's kind of like a fluid. It's like a flow. Really.
Are there any questions from anyone in the audience, or comments even? If not, we'll keep rambling on. Please.
Just comments really overall. The variety of things that you're presenting is extremely sort of rich and interesting and varied. I think where maybe many issues will arise is at the point of spatial practice. And I think one of the interesting things about the things that are being presented, I mean, some of them have roots which I can see where they're coming from, conversations where I can see they're coming from. But it reminds me when Kipnis came to this school many years ago, and he came shooting from the hip, and he said that he accused those people who think like you or thought like you in those days of being informationists. And there was a big battle between the informationists and the neo-formalists, as they were, 90% of the school now. I think one of the interesting things about what you're raising is whether it is spatial practice and what the definition of spatial practice might be. Because I think the conception of space that you're talking about is actually very difficult to delineate in any way. So I think some of the kind of examples that we've been shown are very interesting at doing that. But I think that's one of the issues that really I think needs to be sort of addressed. And I think your book, which sadly I haven't read, so I apologize for that, but I'm sure you deal with it in some ways rather. But that seems to me an absolutely vital thing to be looking at. Because there's an odd thing. You're talking about a spatial reality which is affecting us every day. It is our lives, so I mean, as you say, I can't moan about my telephone without talking to India, which is sort of rather irritating, but I understand that. But the issue is that that's not, at the moment, represented as space. It is not part of an architectural conversation, which is the other thing. So I think there's there's a struggle here to make it part of the architectural conversation. So when you ask the question, was the international competition a similar thing? I thought your answer was very, very good, because it isn't actually. It's a different way of globalization and so on. So I think that key issue of what is this space, what is this spatial globalization, I think is actually quite fascinating. And I'm not too sure what the relevance is of, let's say, the communication systems to look at Mumbai or whatever it might be, to architecture itself. And I feel you're all struggling in this room to make it part of an architectural conversation. And my question to you as a general question, not a criticism, is why? Why is this conversation not outside the architectural profession?
Outside in what sense? Outside of
in the sense that it seems to me that you're talking about something which is absolutely fascinating, as you said on many of the examples that you said. It affects us all, but it somehow there seems to be a will to shoehorn it into an architectural debate. And it seems to me that, not, as I say, not a criticism, it's a contradiction I think that one needs to sort out, because your work is trying to bring it back into an architectural debate, whether it's an intellectual or theoretical or whatever debate. But it is actually desperately trying to bring it back into the institution. And it seems to me that there's a real effort here to look at practices which are outside the institution. And therefore, it's hard to understand why it's being brought back to the institution, apart from the fact that, of course, you're all architects. And we're all architects.
But when you talk about the architectural, Carlos?
My apologies.
When you talk about the architectural, Do you refer to it in terms of production or in terms of architectural
I refer
scale?
to it really. I'm trying to marry the two questions. One is I think what you're talking about is a general topic, and I think it should be talked about. I'm not sure it should be done in an architectural world. And my first comment was to do with really the fact that the architecture profession is being grabbed by two camps still from the Kipnis days, I think. And there are those who think that, you know, creating new forms in digital realms is architecture, and you are proposing something which is completely the opposite, which is what Kipnis was sort of, you know, fighting against. He came around to liking it in the end, but he was fighting against it. Now, all I'm saying is that the profession seems to be elsewhere, and the schools seem to be elsewhere, somewhere in the middle ground. Why do you feel it's important to bring it back into the architectural debate and not into the general debate or a television program or some other venue? Why do you feel that architects need to know these particular issues that you're looking at?
I don't know. I think partly the kind of conflict that arises also starts to become interesting. So actually to kind of almost present it to the people that would kind of not like it in a way, I hope would create a kind of friction that at some point can also become operational. I don't know how.
My answer would be that I don't see the book so much as falling into the realm of architecture as urbanism. And I think the fact that, for example, there's no real school of urbanism as such today. It's something that, especially in Britain, there's various forms of kind of planning, but planning isn't really urbanism. Urbanism is still pretty much a self-appointed precinct of architects who kind of somehow take an interest in this kind of landscape and then somehow over time come to operate in it. And I think one of the fascinating things about the book is that it in fact generally a lot of the contributions deal with the urban realm and kind of like how it's redefining itself. And the city at the moment is, as we all know, and it's almost kind of like territory that's been gone over too much, but it's redefining itself incredibly quickly. And I think both Bea and Celine's project and also my own are much closer. I can really see the links with urbanism, like explaining why certain phenomena are occurring around the world, such as these new cities that are sprouting up in very kind of unexplicable locations, or on a much smaller scale, how the city can be read and interpreted, like what the keys are to the city, such as visible or invisible signs and landmarks, which is, I think, Mumbai has probably always been like that, but probably increasingly like that. The more informal the urbanism becomes, the more relevant these systems of tabbing space in this way become. So I guess it's more useful to somebody who's going to try and engage the urban realm. I think that's kind of a legitimate thing for all of us to be looking at the moment. I think that's where our interest really lies, at least mine.
I mean, perhaps I'd just quickly add that I think, I like the definition of the two camps, the informationists and the new formalists. I think our position is one of a sort of a kind of maybe a kind of contempt. What we feel is a sort of owning up to a sort of realism, which is to suggest that we simply cannot abide or believe anymore in the myth that maybe we once did, that the architect, in order to get his or her kind of vision executed in the world, is actually at all in charge of that happening. And that actually the whole kind of question of where does power lie to effectuate change has gone, well, arguably perhaps it was never there in the first place, yeah? And we sort of duped ourselves into believing, for whatever reason, that we were the ones who were in charge. I think it's very hard in this kind of landscape that we're talking about to even pretend that we're in charge or that architects are in charge anymore. And so, you either kind of, you either adapt or die. So rather than kind of, I think, take a sort of very melancholic position of, well, we're not in charge, we're completely impotent, we might as well give up. I suppose our point, and the point to bring it back in, although I think what we have tried to do with the book is try and make it accessible to hopefully a kind of number of communities of people interested in these kinds of subjects. But what we say is, well, surely the thing to do in order to empower ourselves or empower anyone to somehow navigate through this morass is actually understand the kind of the underlying kind of logic of power or powerlessness that we're somehow part of, whether we like it or not. And in that respect, as I say, I don't think it's certainly not a defeatist position of sort of saying, you know, this is how it is, we can't do anything. But actually, look, this is how it is, what might we do? Or can we do anything? And I think in order to even begin, and ultimately I suppose from our point of view, it's to push forward. I mean, that's why we use this slightly fuzzy term, the spatial practitioner. And we actually have no idea what this means. But we think it's, perhaps it's useful just simply to drop a lot of the baggage that, say, the architect or the urbanist or the planner has, centuries of baggage, and to somehow start afresh and redefine what's possible.
Well, I think, I mean, you all know me anyway, so you're preaching to the converted, but I'm right with you. But I think maybe what I find interesting about what you showed today, and you know what I was really referring to the venue is you know that I think the key possible thing that you're contributing, which I think is very important, is the participate one. So I think the spatial leads to certain confusion because it brings it back into, you know, maybe traditional spatial conversations. You're not talking in any way about traditional spatial configurations or whatever. You're talking about different systems, which I think that's a whole world, I mean, of looking at that. But I think the really challenging what the participate is, and that goes to your urban point, which I think is, you're absolutely right. I think what you're talking about is cities and so on, and city systems really in many ways. I think it's yes, the different ways of actually being involved in that and participating in those, which I think is actually quite important, because in a way, participation is probably the weakest link of all the sort of arguments which are there. It is the most banal version of what it actually means when people say, you know, that's a participatory project. It means, you know, you've asked some questions, and people say they want a swimming pool, you know, which is what I always say, you know, there's no point asking the question. But I think there's a real key there, and I think it'd be interesting to see how these projects actually, in a sense, find ways, or through the venues or through the things that you're doing. So I think I found that particularly strong. And I think it's a different issue to the spatial one. I think the spatial one is defining this sort of weird world that we live in. And I think other people who did exercises to try and identify, you know, the kind of layers of the world and so on, were talking about different worlds. So you got a job on your hands anyway to try and deal with if it hasn't changed so fast that you don't have time to even write your comments on the computer.
Just quickly, maybe one example from the book that's quite telling, maybe, in terms of what we understand as this kind of idea of participation, which doesn't come out of this realm of participation as doing social good or whatever, is a guy called John McSweeney, who is also educated as an architect, and he then worked for TfL, Transport for London, and is now a policymaker in Nepal who's working basically on the issue of water rights between Nepal and India. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to make kind of a judgment in any way, or also in terms of participation, but I think that project is quite rich in terms of this understanding, maybe.
I just have quite a short comment, and I have to give my back to Connors, but I think there is something that, or maybe there's just 2 points I'd like to mention. I mean, the first thing is that I think we're all very aware that there is a very big difference between recognizing the sort of spatial territory and all its ambiguities and acting within it. And I think, you know, the book actually gathers very different approaches to this. Some people are much more active than others, and you might be able to act as an architect on different levels. There might be political, or there might be more spatial or physical. But I mean, the political also has spatial consequences, and vice versa. I think that's the first thing. So also in terms of, the notion of what mapping might be or what spatial practice might be. I mean, I don't think a map is necessarily a spatial practice, but it has consequences in space. And the other thing is that I don't think there's anything particularly radically new about this interest, in a sense that it is so very unsurprising that we are all architects and we're all interested within this sort of, let's say, what maybe superficially seems more ambiguous territory of the architect, but I would say it's exactly the opposite. I think it's the architectural profession that has increasingly isolated itself from the sort of wider discourses of what making space actually means. And we're actually being very conservative, and we think like architects did 100 years ago or 500 years ago. But for some reason, the rest of the architectural profession doesn't. I think it's almost exactly the opposite problem. And there was a lecture given by Mark Cousins in the mid-80s about, I think it's called Building an Architect. Did at the Bartlett. It was then in a book, and he was talking about the fact that as a philosopher, when he first started teaching here, the one thing that he could not believe was quite how secretive architecture was as a discipline. And so from the outside, architects look like they're doing something that they're not doing at all, and it's almost impossible to describe. And I think that's exactly the problem that we're dealing with.
Are there any more comments or questions from the floor? Okay, there's one back here.
I'm not an architect, so you have a few people in the audience who are not. And I just think it's important in terms of these discussions of globalization and global spatial practice. I think intuitively, in most disciplines, at least in social sciences, there is this discussion, this feeling, this intuition that there is something qualitatively different about the linkages you see globally of different types of space. But I just wanted to caution against, from outside architecture, a caution against this almost fetishization of the contemporary, in terms of there being something really new about this contradiction of these different types of spaces. Because if you think about it, it really depends on the perspective of the viewer as to whether or not these things, these juxtapositions, are heterotopic and or contradictions. Because 100 years ago, you still had colonialism, and you had very much still this flow of different ideas and different people and different economies. So that's my comment. And coming to perhaps the previous speaker's question about why this should be architecturally driven, I think this is actually something that spatial thinkers or architects can bring to the table, because from an economic or political perspective, we're grappling with this problematic of what is new about this. And there is something new about it, but maybe it's something that's not obvious to people who don't work in design and architecture and space. So that's my comment / critique. And just picking up on something very interesting that you said, Markus, about American Apparel, I think this is really a question, because you said, is American Apparel something different? And it is something different for people who don't know, American Apparel is this American clothing company that relies on local labor. But what's interesting here is it starts to it highlights the conflation of ideas between participation and space, because really what you're talking about is the problem, as I see it actually, is not that the labor is outsourced to less developed economies. The problem is that the empowerment and the ability of those people that are being employed to actually interact with their employer and perhaps have a better quality of life is the issue. So, comment in particular.
Thank you. No, I think those are fantastic comments. Just to comment on your first comment, you're absolutely right. I mean, and of course, there's unfortunately one's always sort of seduced by the temptation to constantly herald the new, and I think actually in our introduction, one of the points that we make is that why we feel it's a rather germane and opportune time to kind of begin to look at a lot of this territory is that the sort of the degree of visibility that we now have, the kind of the sense in which, you know, your computer suddenly, and it's not that these things were never there, they are absolutely kind of always already there, but the fact that we, part of this, you know, the same fiber optics that make outsourcing possible also make it possible for me to have a direct observation on things that would, as it were, not be there, because they would be militantly kept away from my sight. They'd be militantly kept away from any possibility of me knowing those things. And so you get into this kind of, to use Marx's phrase, a kind of critical momentum, perhaps, of not only things kind of happening, but a sense in which all of us knowing that these things are happening. And I think this is one of the relatively new things, this kind of, you know, to use a kind of cliche, the information bomb, but this sort of sense in which, and to use sort of the word, you know, we all begin to participate in the knowledge of things that we knew kind of were already there, but now that we cannot deny that they're not there anymore. And I think
in that context, there's
important.
also this issue of yours. I mean, we didn't talk about this tonight, but the kind of what we called in the book the professional amateur. And I think there's maybe something about amateurism in this context which is interesting. And actually, I think it's quite good that you said something, because I think it's actually people, I mean, okay, so this is Lisa, she's a political economist. So I think actually that's what we need somehow. We need this kind of external view also, and we need this view to kind of reshape what we're doing and put us in a kind of context to see how we can still participate with other disciplines. And although everyone's constantly talking about kind of cross-disciplinary practice and whatever, it's actually still pretty much within the kind of field of creative practices, and that's very often rather limiting, I think.
Are there any other comments or questions? I think if not, it's a good time to wrap it up. Thank you very, very much for all coming.
For participating.
And thank you for participating. Thank you to Joita for putting this technical marvel together. Thank you, Joita.